We are really excited about our topic today, the process over skills. And Lisa, I know this is a RDI principle, a really foundation principle that you are very passionate about. It has a lot of personal as well as for your family's meaning for you. And so why don't we go ahead and get started, and you tell us about that.
Sure. I'll begin with why I am passionate about this and why it came to mind more recently. I had suggested that we talk about it. I was preparing for a big talk that I was going to be doing for a local autism society, and I knew that a lot of the people there had no idea what RDI was. In fact, that was true. They hadn't even heard of RDI. And so as I prepared for the talk, I started thinking about your traditional types of therapy models that are out there for kids with autism, and most of them focus on developing skills. And I wanted to impart them with some knowledge that would help them understand how that can fall short at times. I'm not saying that skills are bad by any means, but we all need them. But we need to have what the mental processes in place, or the functions, or what I like to refer to as the why bothers. We need to have those in place to allow to provide a foundation for those skills to be meaningful, to know how to use them, when to use them. And so I'll give you an example of my own personal experience and why it's so meaningful to me. When I first learned about autism, I believed that I was educated through our experience with our first therapy model to understand that autism was a collection of behaviors that we needed to extinguish and a collection of behaviors that resembled more typical development that we needed to reinforce. And if we could just find that balance of doing enough of extinguishing and enough reinforcing of the typical behaviors, we would have a child that would be typical or look typical. Well, we were able to actually accomplish that with my son, in that he was able to complete the ABLE, he was able to attend school, he was able to sit for circle and raise his hand, which he never did. But he knew he needed to raise his hand if he wanted to talk, but he never did. Mm-hmm. He could speak in 8 and 10 word sentences, but his sentence structure was all mixed up because he was taught the skill of speech, of saying words, before he was taught the function or the motivation to want to communicate. So even though he could speak in 8 and 10 word sentences, which was typical for a 4.5-year-old, 5-year-old, he was not able to have the reciprocal back and forth communication. And so after having done all of this work, I was still very concerned about my child's ability to function in the real world, because without that continual prompting and prodding and the ability to function in a dynamic world, I felt that he was no less autistic, even though he had all those skills.
Yeah. And so what changed you? Because I know as a parent, and you know I'm a parent too, that like you said in the beginning, you know they need skills, so nobody's saying skills aren't necessary, but what changed you to realize, because that's a pretty big leap, and I know parents who are friends of mine would say it's a hard leap for them to make, because they kind of crave those skills sometimes. How did you change? What changed? Your mental process change? What happened?
Well, first of all, the first thing that happened was I saw Dr. Gutstein speak in 2003, and he described the core deficits of autism to me, and I felt like I had just this whole huge aha moment, because it really, really resonated with me and helped me understand what autism finally was. It wasn't behaviors. It was these internal motivations and these why bothers, or these drives to be able to function in a real world. And I think, so that was the first little, seed that was planted. And then on top of that, he talked about long-term quality of life. And that was the thing that I couldn't quite reconcile with all the skills that my son was being able to develop. I had no confidence that this was going to equate to ability to function in the long run. And that was probably my biggest fear. And when Dr. Gutstein started talking about those studies, the long-term studies for quality of life for individuals with autism, I've always asked all the clients that I work with and some of the parents that I even attended that conference with way back in 2003, I've always asked them, I've kind of polled them almost, how do you hear what he said? And it's interesting to me, and I don't know if it's mentality in terms of like glass half full, or maybe it's just the fear factor or what, but the majority of the people that I talk to say that when they heard him, and he does, but there's maybe it's still online even, there might be a few minute clip where he talks about that quality of life and shares some of the research. Most of the people I talk to say it really was very uncomfortable for them, very, very uncomfortable. And for me personally, I remember thinking, yes, like really excited, which is, I have a little bit of an optimistic kind of perspective on life. But I remember thinking, the reason why I thought yes was because somebody is thinking about this. And nowhere in my prior experience had people thought about what it really meant for long-term quality of life. And so, yeah, we could do a whole nother talk about that at another date in terms of matching your skills now, sorry, not your skills, but the time that you spend focusing on helping your child with matching that with your long-term goals for your child.
Well, I think you do this really nicely in this presentation you prepared. For example, where you say the skills may be the ability to do something like read, but the function would be to gain an information and for enjoyment. That's a very nice example. And I do know, along the years of working with kids, I do know many kids who've really struggled with the skill of reading. So they've had to work on that. That's not, they needed the skill of reading. But that other piece of what you talked about, the function to gain the information for enjoyment, I think your example is really nice about the whole life experience that we're talking about this morning, of the process, why the process has to be in place. It reminds me of, Lisa, I remember we were taught to teach these kind of rote greetings, which we could probably spend a whole webinar on too. Hello, how are you? And I became aware that my son really didn't know why he was doing that. I mean, we develop typically, we may kind of imitate our parents for a little bit when we're little bitty, but we do come to a place where we know why we're doing that. And that didn't happen. So that was a skill. Is it an important skill to greet people? Absolutely, it's an important skill to greet people. But the why bother, like you said, right?
Yes, completely agree. So here's a little humorous story as well. We had several therapists that would come into our home. You grow close to them. I love these girls. They were wonderful. We developed relationships. One weekend, we actually invited our senior therapist and her husband to join us camping. And when the husband of the senior therapist, when he approached my son, he said, "Hey, what's up?" And guess what my son did?
Looked up.
Yeah, he did.
Yeah.
So I thought to myself, oh my goodness, he, in terms of being able to understand the context of this is clearly a social greeting. He just had newly arrived, it's a new approach, and it's within the facial expression and the intonation. I mean, my son should have been able to understand that was a greeting, and so it always stuck with me. Or likewise, the way, another example of skills without the functions or the real life experience, the context, is teaching facial expression through using pictures and not within the context of real world experiences. When we look at in RDI, we would help develop the function or the process of teaching nonverbal communication by using it in real-world context. And the children start to understand that the nonverbal communication holds meaning. They start to become intrigued. And then they unconsciously begin to shift their gaze more and more as they gain greater competency in trying to infer meaning behind the nonverbal communication. And parents learn how to carefully scaffold that as well. And when you teach it within, by having a child look at pictures or like real life pictures, or even worse, the little icons, it just doesn't equate to real world functioning. So are we doing this now? Yeah.
Yeah, I felt I was having a hard time taking myself seriously.
Right. Okay.
But I think your point here about the process requires memories of related past experiences is so key. It's not enough to just the memory piece it's key for all of us though, which is I think something we have to always remember. This isn't special to the kids. It's key for all of us. We just don't think about it, right?
Oh, it is. It's so critical, and I think that not only is it very important that we use real-life experiences to make the experiences meaningful, but we also have to create a whole bunch of those and help the children learn how to link them together in a very dynamic way so that they can access them and use them when they need to. But it starts to happen all at the very subconscious level. But in RDI, we help parents learn how to help the child create those memories initially and be able to access them and make the connections from one experience to a similar experience. It doesn't have to be exact. And I think what happens so often with even so-called, highest or high-functioning individuals with autism, if they don't have that process or the function or motivation, whatever you want to call it, if they don't have that in place, what they're left to do is try to continually analyze the situation so that they can apply the appropriate skill, and that causes them to feel so much anxiety and stress and burnout and potentially depression because they're just struggling. Life is just this constant effort to try to figure out how to fit in, and it can be just really, really difficult. I have a friend who didn't get she received a diagnosis of Asperger's when she was in her 30s, and she used RDI to really work through a lot of the things that she was very challenged with. And years later, I was talking with her, and she said, I don't know if I should even refer to myself as having autism anymore because I'm so much better. And that was like, wow, it's so amazing to hear that kind of self-awareness and then measure her own appraisal of her progress was truly just a beautiful thing to hear. And then it was time after that, maybe another year or two after that, I remember having another conversation with her, and she said, I'm really not dealing with my autism anymore. That's so much better, but I'm dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder. I don't mean to laugh because it's not funny. It's just, I think that goes from years of trying to function with skills, trying to, be able to survive with just skills, but without those underlying mental processes. So.
Yes, and it's just a fact that for the children, some things are going to be taught, shall we say, without the why bother first. And I'll tell parents that. They'll say, well, does this mean we're all messed up? And I'm like, no, but we've got to start focusing on the why bother. As you say, Lisa, it's going to happen that some skills are taught without that, because we don't have it. While our model is about typical development, the children haven't developed typically at the point that we intervene. So we have to work with that. I think your point about PTSD, though, is so important, because why wouldn't somebody be traumatized by this experience, right?
Right. Most definitely. Most definitely. And I think that sometimes, too, even when I'm starting to prime or preview a family for the underlying function to develop the motivation for that mental process, the thing that, you know, initially it could be perceived as almost looking like I'm teaching a skill, but we're looking to start to practice that in meaningful real-world experiences and with greater complexity and so on, so that the child, you know, we don't just teach it at the table and not use a meaningful experience to do so. Like, yeah, so I thought I would just add that for maybe newer families and thinking about what it might look like. It's a process. Let's put it that way.
It's the process of the process.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
And I think I'm like you. When I first heard Dr. Gutstein talk about this at a conference, I mean, it blew me away, because as a parent, you start seeing that. You start seeing this. I call it a creeping awareness. For some, it may be more sudden than that, but for me, it's a creeping awareness that while we're gaining these skills, and in our case, some of the skills came very, very hard for him, but it still wasn't enough. And you knew it. I knew it, but I didn't know what it was. When he spoke, it's like, that is not for me a creeping awareness. It's like a veil has been lifted. Where you're like, of course, that's exactly what it is. So I do love remembering back to that moment, because it changed our lives, and that's what I try to get across to families, Lisa. It's a life-changing thing, don't you think?
Else, she's had enough for me.
Oh, I definitely do, and I really love that you brought this point up, because it makes me think of pronouns. Oh my goodness. Our senior therapist, our ABA therapist, had also said to me at one point in time, she said, pronouns will be the death of me. And I said, but I had become an RDI consultant by then, or had at least started training. And I said, well, of course they will, because you're not teaching self-awareness. Once you teach once a child understands self-awareness, pronouns effortlessly develop. At least that's what we saw with our son. Unless, I mean, I guess there could be other circumstances. I have a little child on my caseload right now who I think a bad habit had developed in some context in terms of she clearly was capable of starting to use pronouns, but had just continued to refer to herself as her first name. But once the parents started to just kind of look at her, they actually just give her a look, and then she corrects it. So I think in that situation, it was a little bit of maybe a bad habit that had developed. So, but anyway, yeah, it's quite fascinating how in this slide here, the last point says that we can think of the process as the glue you need to hold the skills in place. So skills tend to naturally develop when the process is in place or the functions are in place.
And I love that you say that it's a glue, because the glue insinuates that it must be there or the thing will fall apart. And I think that's really a key piece for us. It's not, well, it'd be nice if we had it, right? It's a glue. It's critical to how everything's going to go forward. Like your friend who said, she after, years of not knowing her diagnosis, then knowing it, and then addressing it, how she didn't even know if to say she had autism anymore. That's because the glue was there, right?
Right, definitely, most definitely. And also, even I think if parents can really slow down and try to reflect on what's working and what's not, they may realize that the skills that they have developed or their skills that their child may have developed can sometimes fall short. So what I mean by that is if they look at teaching the child that skill to be able to say hi, to do a greeting, but it may be somewhat prompted at times because the child isn't truly motivated to want to connect with people.
That's right.
It just feels less than satisfying, and I often struggle with that. I appreciate that parents want to teach their children good manners.
Yes.
But it's when is a good time to really focus your efforts on that versus focusing your efforts on wanting to, and I don't judge, but I do kind of struggle with that a little bit because I don't ever want to demotivate a child either by putting too much emphasis on having, if they're not ready, and maybe that's even aversive to them to have to look at somebody and say hello. That might be aversive because they're not there yet. They're not ready. So I don't want to do anything that would,
Lisa, I think about typical development, and I used to, this may sound kind of funny, but to me it's a funny story anyway. It may sound a little odd, I should say, but to me it's just a funny story. But as years went by and I knew more and more about ASD, and I thought about this, you mentioned judging. I actually thought about how if the children had the label, they were judged for not saying hello to an adult or a peer or ignoring somebody. And I would start noticing my friends' children say walking. This one moment, I just remember going by a boy that we knew. I mean, they were family friends and saying hello, and he just stared at me, and he had no diagnosis, and he doesn't. He was just a preteen, kind of in a mood. And he just kind of stared at me, and I remember thinking, if he had a label of ASD, everybody would say, "Oh, that's why." But I think it's a really important point because I think we sometimes end up putting all this pressure on the children with this diagnosis to be normal, and actually normal is not a continual state of sameness.
Right.
And like that boy, he's probably in a bad mood. Maybe he had a fight with his parents. Who knows? You know what I mean? But it's normal is actually not just I always greet people with a big smile on my face and in the same way, right? It's very interesting to think about.
It is, and I often say that normal is setting on the dryer.
Oh, I like that. Yeah. I'm going to use that.
Yeah, and even thinking about, in RDI, even thinking about, understanding the different messages that people can relay. I remember working on, if you ask somebody, how was your day, and they say, fine, versus fine. I mean, there's a lot of different meaning in that, right?
There is.
Yeah.
Have you ever, another thing I noticed that kind of speaks to process versus why bother is I've noticed that people just in general actually do have little rote scenarios in their mind, and sometimes I'll greet somebody and they'll greet me, and I'll say hi, and they'll say fine.
And I've done that.
Oh, well, good. I didn't ask, but I'm glad to know it.
I know that is true. That's funny.
It is very funny.
So I'm cognizant of the time, and I don't think it's necessary to go over all of these slides because people can browse over them a little bit while we're chatting, but I'm just going to pick out one, which is, I think, really critical and often gets misunderstood as well, and that is teaching children eye contact. So it's the very last one. And how in the work that we do, we help teach parents, first and foremost, how to analyze their child's gazing. And that, to me, was huge. It was huge. It was kind of a concept that wasn't actually newly developed with RDI, because RDI is this ever-changing program that's, excuse me, I have a frog in my throat. It's cutting edge, and so I remember it was new in my experience with RDI, but But learning how to analyze children's gazing was, I felt like I understood what they were thinking once I was able to do that.
Dare I say it's a real eye-opener?
Yes. Yes, exactly.
It is. Yeah.
So we don't teach children to use eye contact. We give them a reason to use their gaze shifting so that they can learn how to understand their world better. And in that process, we can help. Again, we understand what they're thinking.
It's such a critical piece of what we do. Again, it was such a big aha moment for me when Dr. Gutstein discussed this, but it made so much sense. And I think, as you say, being aware that our time is short now, I think that's the thing I would have parents, if they're new to this, do, is really think about it. When you start thinking about, say, teaching a child to look at you through the old-fashioned, which hopefully folks aren't still doing this, look at me. I know they are, but even that's a whole nother conversation. Don't get me started. But it doesn't make sense. Or as I like to say, there is a function of look at me, and it is when my children have really, really done something they shouldn't, and I would say, look me in the eye when I'm talking to you, because they don't want to gaze shift with me. Because I had my Maleficent hat on or whatever, and I was being really tough. Or look at me, darn I cute. I mean, I will tell parents, those are the only scenarios at which you would tell somebody to look at you. And it makes a lot of sense to them when we contrast it with the process that you're discussing and the way we gaze shift and the reasons that we do that, and that they are internally motivated by our why bothers. So why would I do that? And I tell them too, we're not aware that we do that. It's developed in us from a very young age. And we see it develop. If we watch a baby develop, it's a beautiful thing to watch over time as it starts to come in because of the why bothers. So
that's right.
Anything else? I know our time is short. Lisa, did you want to make a closing comment about this wonderful topic today?
Well, I'm happy that people have joined us, and if they're watching in the archives, I hope that this was enlightening for you. And if you have any questions, you can just feel free to contact me. My email is lisapal, it's LISAPAL, @simpatico.ca, or you could get this conversation going perhaps on the parent forum, maybe share any moments of aha. I guess that's the other thing I'd like to leave you with, is to maybe think about your own experiences with your child and maybe any aha moments or discoveries that you may have made or will make in the future moving forward.